every now and again, the antagonist of a story will devise a scheme that's actually really clever. Even if it doesn't work, the amount of effort the evildoer puts into it is impressive. Now, their actions may be deplorable, but you have to tip your hat to how well thought out some of these ideas actually are. So, with that in mind then, I'm Ellie with What Culture, here with smartest villain plans in movies. Syndrome's Omnidroid in The Incredibles. In The Incredibles, Syndrome plots to launch his destructive robot, the Omnidroid, onto a heavily populated city. After he swoops in to destroy it, it's assumed that society will perceive him as a superhero. In most comic-themed stories, the villain has some sort of doomsday device which the hero ultimately destroys after exploiting an obvious weakness. However, Syndrome is fully aware of this. He's been obsessed with superheroes since childhood and knows how resourceful they are at uncovering weaknesses in weapons and doomsday machines. In fact, Syndrome used this fact to his advantage. For years, he hired superheroes under the guise of a mysterious benefactor and asked them to destroy the Omnidroid, which had supposedly gone rogue on an island. If the superhero emerged triumphant, Syndrome rebuilt the robot so it was immune to the way it was defeated. If the Omnidroid won, then that was one less superhero for Syndrome to worry about. By the time the insidious supervillain believed he had killed every superhero on Earth, only then did he release the Omnidroid on the public, which by this point was nearly invincible. Although Syndrome was beaten by a baby, it was still a masterfully orchestrated stratagem, hiding in plain sight in more ways than one in Inside Man. Inside Man opens with a criminal called Dalton Russell claiming he pulled off the perfect bank robbery. Now, every facet of Russell's plan is meticulously thought out. Forcing the hostages in the bank to dress the same way as the robbers so the police can't tell them apart is genius. He also sends recordings of Albanian chatter through the police radio waves so the detective on the case will waste hours to translate and decipher the messages, unaware it has absolutely nothing to do with the robbery. But the masterstroke is the finale. Once the police have the bank surrounded, it looks like Russell is done. Instead of trying to escape, Russell takes a bag of priceless diamonds and seals himself inside the supply room behind a fake wall. 1 week later, he exits through the fake wall and walks out the front door. What makes Russell's success all the more satisfying is the fact that he bumps into the detective just before he leaves the bank. That detective was in the presence of the man he was assigned to arrest, and he just let him walk out, oblivious of his true identity, irradiating Fort Knox's gold in Goldfinger. In Goldfinger, James Bond learns that a German tycoon called Auric Goldfinger aims to break into Fort Knox. Assuming that he plans to steal the vault's gold, Bond confronts the maniacal mogul and explains that his scheme won't work. Because there is nearly 13,000 tons of gold in the facility, there's no way Goldfinger could steal it all before the army intervened. But Goldfinger isn't going to steal the gold, he's going to irradiate it. His plan is to set off a dirty bomb in Fort Knox, making billions of dollars worth of gold inert for half a century. This would cause Goldfinger's own gold to skyrocket while the economy collapses. Even though most Bond villain plans are fantastical, this one is theoretically possible. In fact, an economist for the World Bank stated that Goldfinger's scheme is pretty solid. What's really interesting is that Goldfinger was intending to steal the gold in the novel and the original script. When the filmmakers realized the logistics of such a crime would be impossible, they altered Goldfinger's plan to make it more realistic. Frankenstein switches bodies in Revenge of Frankenstein. Throughout the Hammer series of Frankenstein, the authorities are constantly pursuing the titular scientist to put a stop to his barbaric and ungodly experiments. Because his ability to reanimate the dead is disregarded as pseudoscience, each film in the franchise revolves around Victor Frankenstein trying to recreate his most famous experiment to prove his naysayers wrong. After living for over 3 years under the unsubtle pseudonym of Dr. Stein, Frankenstein is exposed and viciously attacked by the locals. When the police come to arrest him, they learn the deranged doctor has died from his injuries. After inspecting his body, they confirm that Victor Frankenstein is finally dead. Or so it seems. Before he perished, Frankenstein had his assistant transfer his brain into a new body, which was then reanimated with the same technology that brought his original monster to life. Now that the authorities have closed the case on Frankenstein, the mad scientist is free from all persecution, allowing him to live freely in his new form. He's also satisfied that he evaded the authorities by performing the exact same experiment that all of society condemned him for. Palpatine's Order 66 in Star Wars Episode 3: Revenge of the Sith. As a galactic senator, Sheev Palpatine cultivated the persona of a politician with his people's best interests at heart. Little did anyone know that he was secretly reviving the Sith under the persona of Darth Sidious. As he claimed more and more political power, he performed atrocities behind the shadows, including putting hits on Queen Amidala, having Qui-Gon killed, and commissioning the construction of a moon-sized battle station. The reason why Palpatine's plan worked so well was because he knew when to act, and more importantly, when not to. When he was promoted to Supreme Chancellor, he didn't expose his true intentions. Even after he assembled a clone army, he didn't attack anyone publicly. Only after he turned Anakin to the dark side did he execute Order 66, forcing the clone troopers to instinctively hunt and wipe out all the Jedi. By the time Obi-Wan and Yoda learned Palpatine was the mastermind behind the Sith return, it was too late. He had too much power politically and physically. The Jedi were gone. It may have taken Palpatine years to initiate his plan fully, but it allowed him to rule the galaxy for decades. Sauron's failsafe in The Lord of the Rings. Most villains' downfall stems from the fact that they overestimate themselves. Even though criminal masterminds like Kingpin and the Joker are defeated time and time again, they always assume their next crime spree will succeed. They rarely consider the possibility that they are destined to fail. But one person who didn't suffer from this trope was the antagonist of The Lord of the Rings, Sauron. Because he led the largest army in Middle-earth and harbored the One Ring, the ruler of Mordor was the strongest being in existence. Despite his vast power though, Sauron wasn't arrogant enough to believe his plans could not end with failure. In the event of his death, the Dark Lord placed a failsafe on the One Ring so his soul would transfer to it. Despite the fact the ring could be destroyed in the fires of Mount Doom where it was forged, Sauron poured his dark magic into it so the wielder would be compelled to protect it under any circumstances. Even after his body was destroyed, this backup plan allowed Sauron to cheat death for 2,500 years. Thanos wins in Avengers Infinity War. Before the release of Avengers Infinity War, many cinema goers unfamiliar with Thanos were worried that the Mad Titan would prove a disappointment. What does he even do? He's just sat in a chair for years. Why doesn't he get the Infinity Stones himself if he wants them so badly? But when the film was released, it was clear that Thanos' inaction was because he was waiting for the perfect moment to obtain the cosmic gems. After he knew where all but one of them were, he still couldn't make a move since the Space Stone was heavily guarded in Asgard. But the instant Asgard was destroyed, he tracked the Power Stone first, knowing it would allow him to overpower anyone. He then located the Asgardian ship that housed the Space Stone and used its properties to teleport around the universe, allowing him to easily retrieve the others. Even though he had been preparing this plan for years, he attained all 6 stones in days and successfully wiped out half of all life in the universe with their power. The Avengers may have reversed his actions, but the ending of Infinity War proved to be the most humiliating defeat Earth's mightiest heroes had ever received. Ozymandias' preemptive strike in Watchmen. Since the dawn of storytelling, antagonists have had a habit of monologuing their diabolical scheme in astounding detail, either to another character, the audience, or even their arch-nemesis. The ancient Greeks did it, Shakespeare characters did it. Heck, Bond villains explain their master plan to their mortal enemy with charts, models, and video footage. But no one monologues more than supervillains. It's regarded sacrilegious for a comic book baddie not to lay out their intentions in graphic detail. But the big bad of Watchmen, Ozymandias, did away with this time-honored tradition. After Night Owl and Rorschach learn their former comrade intends to kill millions to save billions, Ozymandias explains he will blow up key cities across the globe using Dr. Manhattan's radiation signature, framing Manhattan in the process. Because Manhattan's power is perceived as godlike, all nations would be forced to put their differences aside and ally against their common enemy. When the heroes threaten to expose him, Ozymandias points out that he initiated his plan minutes before they arrived. He then turns on the monitor, showing he's already triggered the Manhattan explosions, killing 15 million people. Even though the closing shot hints that Ozymandias will be implicated, the heroes still failed to stop him. Simon's plan would have worked in Die Hard with a Vengeance. In Die Hard with a Vengeance, Simon Gruber threatens to blow up a school in New York unless John McClane plays a cat-and-mouse game with him. Meanwhile, the FBI and the police force are desperately trying to locate which school harbors the explosive. What they don't realize is that Simon has sent them off on a wild goose chase while he breaks into the Federal Reserve Bank, which contains more wealth than any vault on Earth. Disguising his men as subway car repair workers, Simon breaks into the reserve through an aqueduct and hauls out $140 billion worth of gold in 14 dump trucks. After scripting this scene, the writer Jonathan Hensley was contacted by the FBI and asked how he knew the reserves vault was beside a subway spur and could be accessed through an aqueduct tunnel. Hensley reassured the Bureau that he wasn't a criminal, but the agent he spoke to said someone could actually pull this off. He even had a meeting with other agents to strengthen the reserve security. That's right, the FBI thought that this plan was so foolproof that they thought the writer may have been a terrorist and had to update the vault's safeguards. Richmond Valentine manipulated everyone. Kingsman: The Secret Service. Kingsman: The Secret Service is an off-the-wall, for lack of a better term, crazy movie that takes full advantage of eccentric and bombastic visuals and action sequences. As such, it needed an equally eccentric and bombastic villain, which it got in the form of Samuel L. Jackson's Richmond Valentine. As a multi-billionaire with the ultimate goal of culling the world's population, leaving only the elite and wealthy, Richmond utilised his resources immaculately well. Not only was his seemingly limitless pot of money put to good use, so were his reputation and his connections. Valentine preyed on those he wanted to rid the world of by appealing to what they needed and wanted most, essentially unlimited data that wouldn't cost them a penny. This was master manipulation, and through his SIM cards put the entire world within range of the signal he let off that set them all to slaughtering each other. Jackson's character brought onto his side powerful people, including the President of the United States, Swedish royalty, and the head of Kingsman. Had it not been for the suspicion and sleight of hand of Eggsy, Arthur would have killed the one remaining threat to Valentine's scheme, and it would have gone off without a hitch. Even with what remained of the Kingsmen ultimately bringing him down, this villain still managed to successfully set off the impulse that must have seen an immeasurable amount of people killed. Frank Costello made himself untouchable, The Departed. Sometimes the genius of a villain doesn't necessarily come through in their actions or their schemes. In the case of The Departed's Frank Costello, it was the infrastructure of defense he built around himself to ensure his own protection. Costello was involved in some pretty heinous things and naturally became a high priority target of the Massachusetts State Police. So what better way to stay ahead of the curve than to have someone on the inside? Instead of buying someone already on the force, Frank took a young Colin Sullivan under his wing and sent him to the academy for the sole purpose of being his mole. Sullivan rose through the ranks and was able to misdirect investigations from within, tip his boss off about would-be career-ending sting operations, and give him a layer of protection that saved him and his operation on more than one occasion. Aside from Sullivan, Costello also protected himself with the smart move of becoming a protected FBI informant, trading information for even more grace from the feds. All movie gangsters have a shelf life and are eventually stopped, but Costello's intelligence and contingency plans allowed him to operate and enjoy the life a lot longer than most. Who knows how long he would have gone on unbothered had Sullivan not found out he was an informant and killed him for it. Bane and Talia al Ghul took over Gotham City. The Dark Knight Rises. In Batman Begins, Ra's al Ghul unsuccessfully fought to bring Gotham City his own warped version of liberation and justice. He was stopped in his tracks by Batman, who tore down the League of Shadows, but in The Dark Knight Rises, Tom Hardy's Bane looked to fulfill his former master's destiny. The plan was simple yet effective. He got rid of the Batman, he trapped every GCPD cop underneath the city, he created a huge nuclear bomb and murdered the only man capable of disarming it, and forced the army to keep everyone inside the city by threatening to blow it up if even one person escaped. Bane even destroyed both Harvey Dent's character and the ideals that came with it with the truth about his villainous turn. The prisoners of Blackgate Prison were freed and Gotham fell under martial law, and under the control of the likes of Bane, the Scarecrow, and the rest of the criminal underworld. Things would have stayed this way if it wasn't for the miraculous and frankly unbelievable recovery of Bruce Wayne, and the ease with which he managed to return to his home under complete lockdown. Of course, Bane was working under Ra's al Ghul's daughter Talia, who in her role as Miranda Tate managed to convince Bruce to build the fusion reactor that would eventually become the bomb way in advance. This was the perfect plan to bring all of Gotham completely to its knees, had they not underestimated the power and resilience of the Dark Knight himself, of course. Cole Williams earned some retirement money. 21. In 2008, 21 released recounting the true story of a group of MIT students who counted cards in Vegas. After taking the casinos on the strip for unthinkable amounts of cash, Jim Sturgis's Ben Campbell was caught by pit boss Cole Williams, who beat him to a pulp before making him an offer. He would allow Ben one more night of gambling in his casino. He would even let him keep the winnings, so long as team leader Professor Rosa was brought into his grasp. Williams didn't care about Ben. He held a long-time grudge against Rosa, who had taken his casino for 7 figures when he was at his father's funeral, and in doing so cost him his job. The plan was executed perfectly, as Ben and his team made a profit of $640,000, while Rosa fell into the hands of Williams as agreed. When the time came, however, Cole went back on his word and demanded that Ben hand over the chips. Just to be certain, he made sure he was taken seriously with just a glance at his gun. The ruthless pit boss took the money and went from the brink of being forced out of a soon-to-be obsolete profession with no pension to speak of, to living the high life, sunning himself by the pool. Some villains find success with intricate plans, while the genius here was in its simplicity. Let Ben rob the casino blind, then intimidate him into handing the money over without so much as lifting a finger. Winner winner, chicken dinner. Zemo destroyed the Avengers, Captain America Civil War. The Avengers made for themselves no shortage of enemies since first teaming up to fight off Loki's invasion in 2012, one of which was the incredibly calculated and utterly ruthless Helmut Zemo, who swore to destroy Earth's mightiest heroes. After seeing his entire family killed in Sokovia, something for which he blamed Robert Downey Jr.'s Iron Man and co., and watching these so-called heroes go home and celebrate victory, Zemo crafted a plan to bring down the team. For this, however, he had to think smarter than just about every other MCU villain before him. Zemo was intelligent and self-aware enough to know that he couldn't beat the Avengers in a fistfight. Stronger beings than he had tried and lost. Instead, he sought to plant the seed so that the team crumbled from within, something that worked to devastating effect. Utilizing what he knew of Hydra and centering around the fact that Bucky Barnes had killed Tony Stark's parents, he manipulated Cap and Iron Man until they were quite literally at each other's throats. A lot can be said about the intricacies of Zemo's plan, sometimes bordering on the ludicrous and relying too much on what he arguably couldn't control, but he brought the Avengers to their knees just as he had promised. John Doe knew exactly what Mills would do. 7. There is some fierce competition, but you could argue that 7 is up there as the best work to come from acclaimed director David Fincher. It is a thriller from start to finish, but the genius of the whole thing hinges on the final moments as John Doe's ultimate plan comes to fruition. Throughout the film, the killer targeted unconnected victims based on the 7 deadly sins. With 5 bodies down, there was just envy and wrath left on the list, which is where the true nature of his masterpiece was revealed. It was at this point he brought Brad Pitt's Detective Mills into proceedings. John Doe committed arguably the most heinous and vile murder of them all by decapitating Mills' innocent wife Tracy and presenting her head to the detective in a box. He knew exactly how Pitt's character would react, and in doing so solidified his posthumous victory. In a blind fit of rage, Mills gunned down John. The villain knew exactly what would happen and sacrificed himself for the sake of his work, becoming the victim of wrath to conclude his masterpiece. He truly was ahead of the curve for the entire story, and used everything he learned about his adversaries to lure them into a scenario from which they couldn't possibly have won. Jigsaw's first game, Saw. There are plenty of villains who have manipulated the people around them like pieces on a chessboard, but in Saw, the Jigsaw killer was different. He didn't just move the pieces, he created the entire game and made it so that there would only ever be one winner. Prior to kidnapping Lawrence and Adam and pitting them against each other with horrifying instructions and brutal mind games, John Kramer dished out his brand of hideously ironic punishments and did so while eluding capture by the police. He even created contingency plans so that if anyone did come sniffing around, as Tap and Sing did, he could lead them right into getting their head blown off their shoulders. Jigsaw was described as thinking through every possible angle, and he was always multiple steps ahead. He tracked both Lawrence and Adam, forced them into doing exactly what he wanted, and even found a way to experience it all firsthand by posing as a corpse between his 2 shackled victims. Arguably, the smartest part of Jigsaw's plan was the fact that he kept himself clean and manipulated others into doing the killing for him. He himself didn't kill a single person in the 2004 outing. Whether he wanted Lawrence to kill Adam or Zepp to kill Lawrence's family if Adam remained alive, ultimately, they had no choice but to obey. Even if he wanted his victim to do something so unthinkable as to saw off their own foot, they would eventually have to do it. 12 Moving Parts: Murder on the Orient Express. Originally published way back in 1934, Murder on the Orient Express is a classic, and arguably one of the most famous murder mysteries of all time. A fitting introduction to Kenneth Branagh's take on the legendary Hercule Poirot in 2017. The retelling of the story featured a genuinely stellar ensemble cast, all of which came together to murder Johnny Depp's Edward Ratchett upon the famous train. The logistics of getting all 12 killers in the same place required a certain genius in and of itself, but the act of the murder was on another level. The plan anchored on 12 stab wounds from 12 separate people, with each forming part of an alibi that would clear not only themselves but also others in the party. The spanner thrown in the works by the train being stopped could have derailed the entire plan, but for some equally genius improvisation and misdirection to keep Poirot off the scent, like a carefully placed knife in the back to create the illusion of a single killer still on the loose. Ultimately, the murderers on the Orient Express were brought down by mere coincidence and the back luck of being on the same train as the self-proclaimed greatest detective in the world. No one but Hercule Poirot could have pieced together this mystery and found that the guilty party was not one, but 12 killers. Mysterio died a hero, Spider-Man Far From Home. Villains in the MCU have been fueled by different motivations throughout the years, from the want for power or revenge to perceived justice and the so-called correction of the universe. In Spider-Man Far From Home, Quentin Beck was different, however, as he wanted to become the world's greatest hero in a world without Tony Stark. Whether or not he was actually a hero didn't matter, it was about how he was perceived by the world. So he used his BARF technology to produce the illusion of believable Avengers-level threats before posing as a savior from another dimension and dispatching them, earning the love of the adoring public. So good were Beck's illusions that he tricked Peter Parker into giving him access to every single one of Tony Stark's protocols. This was the genius of his plan, and even when Spider-Man seemingly defeated him, Mysterio still had one ace up his sleeve that meant that he would die with everyone still believing that he was the next Iron Man. His failsafe in the event of being defeated by Spider-Man? Something as simple as doctoring some footage, painting Spidey as a murderer and revealing poor Peter's identity. Even now, much of the public of the Marvel Cinematic Universe believes that Mysterio was the greatest hero they had, which is exactly what Quentin Beck wanted. Like Zemo, he won. Kaizer Soze stayed hidden, the usual suspects. You could argue that the best villains, or at the very least the smartest villains, are the ones who are never caught. In the case of the usual suspects, Kaizer Soze went to great lengths to ensure that he remained elusive, even when he was actually brought into police custody. The name of Kaizer Soze became something of a myth in both the criminal underworld and the circles of law enforcement, but no one could ever claim to know who he was. This was the first step of brilliance. Soze always kept a middleman between himself and anyone he worked with. Often people were working in his employ and didn't even realise it, making it impossible for him to be implicated. This middleman, a lawyer by the name of Kobayashi, if Soze himself was to be believed, ensured that none of the untrustworthy characters he worked with could ever bring him down. He was untouchable. Even when he did find himself in police custody, he had the presence of mind to spin a tale of lies that saw him walk right out of the door. The man under the guise of verbal Kint strung along Special Agent Kuyan during an interrogation with a story pulled out of thin air, with a little inspiration from the bulletin board in the office, selling the ghost story of Soze while earning his own freedom. Kuyan may have eventually suspected the truth, but by that time it was far too late. Verbal Kint was gone, as was his limp.